For the last 2+ years, AI was sold to enterprises the same way Vegas sells a steak and egg breakfast for $1.99. Cheap, all you can eat, per user per month, come on in. And that's how the old Vegas used to be. If you go to Vegas recently, you don't get the $1.99 buffet, but that's how it used to be. And that's how AI is today. It was a subsidy, and the subsidies eventually end. The switch got flipped from subscription to consumption, and the calls to my guest today started rolling in the moments the bills did. And that's what we're going to talk about here in episode 287 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you.
3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 287. My name is Eric Kimberling. I've been in the digital transformation space for about 30 years now, and I'm also the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I've got a great show for you today. We're going to have Scott Bickley from Infotech Research Group here on the show, and we're going to talk about AI tokenization and software contracts, AI cost, long-term governance, long-term cost, long-term ROI, all the things that a lot of corporations and leaders are thinking about as it relates to AI right now. And we're going to get to that here in just a moment. But before we do, just a couple of things that I really want to dive into here today. First of all, here's an interesting story about another failed ERP project. It wasn't just a failure that's the interesting part. It's the fact that there's a class action lawsuit related to it that just recently breaking. This is related to a company called DNOW, which had recently acquired or merged with another company called MRC Global. And if you don't know, DNOW is a multi-billion-dollar organization. I think they do about 3 or 4 billion in revenue, and they make industrial components for energy companies. And so a manufacturing distribution company, they use, from what I understand, they're using SAP. They've got a legacy SAP environment, but they acquired a company or merged with a company called MRC Global. And at the time they were going through this merger, MRC was going through an Oracle implementation, right? They had recently just gone through an Oracle implementation. And they had recently said, just right before the acquisition, in fact, there was a Q3 2025 earnings call the day before the merger closed, where management at MRC Global had assured investors that they had completed their implementation of a quote-unquote state-of-the-art enterprise resource planning system, or ERP system, that promised inventory management to be improved, order processing efficiency, and supply chain optimization. Now, DNOW allegedly minimized the integration risks, reassuring the market that MRC's past software glitches were merely an isolated one-time event. But then what happened is the merger is completed. DNOW and MRC complete their merger, and then it comes out that the Oracle implementation actually wasn't going so well. They had already gone live on the system, but it was causing operational disruption, is wreaking havoc on the organization. And then DNOW came out and reported their Q4 and the full year 2025 results, revealing that MRC revenues had sharply declined due to persistent ERP challenges, and acknowledging that MRC software implementation was in fact an obstacle. So interesting stuff. I mean, you go from just, a few weeks go by, November of 2025, they're given reassurances that the Oracle implementation was going fine. They had completed the implementation. It was successful. Things were going great, et cetera, et cetera. And then just a few months later in February, they disclosed that actually things weren't going so great. Our revenues are down, our profits are down, largely as a result of our ERP disruptions. So not the kind of reassurance or not the confidence inspiring information that an investor wants to see or hear. And they also cited some operational flaws and guidance delays. So management conceded that the flawed software design architecture caused severe operational slowdowns. It impeded customer service and required substantial unexpected capital expenditure to remediate. So as a result, DNOW had to delay its sequential and full year 2026 financial guidance. And based on that information, the DNOW stock crashed 19% in a single session. So now you've got this statement that came out from a law firm. They're called Higgins Berman. I'm not familiar with them, but they're called Higgins Berman, and they are basically the lead attorneys in this class action lawsuit. And they're actually looking for investors who have been harmed by this news, investors that may have lost money as a result of this announcement. Now, if you're not familiar with how the public markets work, you have to disclose anything that's material to earnings or that could materially affect the short-term and long-term potential of an organization. Investors have a right to know that. And so that's part of being a publicly traded company. And even if you're not a publicly traded company, you have someone who has a vested interest in knowing how the company is going to perform. You have owners of the company. You may not have shareholders per se, but you have someone that owns the company that wants to know this stuff, that needs to know this stuff. And then you have employees and customers and stakeholders that should know as well. So even if you're not a publicly traded company, I would argue that this is a big deal in terms of not only being transparent to other stakeholders, but also I think this goes even deeper than that, which is how do you ensure that the leadership of an organization has the visibility into how a digital transformation is going and how a technology is going to impact their operations. Now, I would argue and submit to you that a lot of times leaders don't take an active enough role in their own implementations, and it's incumbent on them to find a way to get the visibility into how the technology implementation is going. Now, here's the thing, which is really interesting about this case too, is that they said that the implementation went well. And on paper, maybe it did go well. Maybe the implementation functionality was working the way everyone intended it to. But somehow, somewhere along the way, the technology and the business collided, and the business and the technology were not working well together. Now, let's just assume that Oracle was not the problem. Let's just assume that Oracle technology was not the problem, because a lot of organizations have implemented Oracle. A lot of organizations have implemented SAP and Microsoft and Workday and NetSuite and all these big major platforms out there. So the software works. The question is, how does it work for any given organization? And so something happened along the way to where the technology and the business collided. Business can't function either because people weren't trained. Maybe the data was migrated inappropriately. Maybe the software was configured in a working way, but it didn't work the way the business needed it to. Maybe there was resistance to change. Maybe the integration to other systems didn't work. Who knows? There's a lot of different things that could have gone wrong here. But the point is, whatever the problem was, the leaders of this organization should have known. And whether that meant the leader should have taken a more active role in understanding what the real status of the project is and really digging into understanding the business implications of what they were doing along the way, whether it was that, whether the project team should have been more transparent and bubbling up issues or managing the project as a true business transformation rather than just simply a technology implementation. I don't know which of those scenarios was most appropriate here because I wasn't there. But what I will say is that this is a very common dynamic. This is something we commonly see where you get people internally that are so hell-bent on myopically implementing technology that they don't think about how it's going to affect the business. They're focused on going live on time, on budget. They're focused on hitting milestones. They're focused on delivering a tangible working product, but they aren't necessarily focused on ensuring that the business can use the technology. And that's where these projects break down. That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where, quite frankly, things tend to go off the rails. So even if the implementation looks successful, even if you think you had a successful go live, the question then is what happens after go live? There's so many times where we talk to clients or people come to us and say, hey, look, we had a successful go live. It was a non-event. And I'll typically say, okay, that's great. You didn't, the sky didn't fall on day one of your go live, but let's look at your business again in 30, 60, 90 days, 6 months from now. Then let's talk. Then let's look at, what your real business value is and what that looks like. That's where you commonly see that deferred pain, if you will, or that the true reality of how a project actually goes is what your organization looks like months and years after the implementation. So just a good reminder that not only do you have to be transparent with management needs to take a more active role in understanding how the projects go. And ultimately, investors will sue over this. And this isn't the first time, by the way. There's been other cases recently. In fact, there's been a couple other cases I've talked about in this podcast and in my YouTube videos One in particular was the Vital Farms case. If you recall, I've talked about that here in this podcast. I made a separate video about this, about how Vital Farms back in 2026 was sued by some shareholders for the same thing. They had a go live that was described as stabilizing and going okay, but in reality, they were not able to ship product and they were missing their numbers, and there was a lot of issues that were happening along the way. So this isn't the first time. I think it's becoming more and more common. Unfortunately, I think investors are honing in on this technology disruption sort of thing, and it's certainly something that's going to further be impacted by AI. I think as we look to AI and some of the uncertainty behind it, and the fact that we're on the bleeding edge of technology here, and it's unproven, and it's still it's technology we as a society are still trying to get comfortable with, and organizations are out there trying to implement it at the same time and figure it out themselves. I think you're going to start to see more of these sort of lawsuits. So if you're seeing lawsuits in the ERP space where it's a fairly proven technology that's been around for a long time, and yet companies are still failing at a miserable rate, companies are still getting sued over these technologies, not only because of the failures, but also because of these disclosure allegations and financial impacts that people are alleging in courts. I think if you look at the ERP space, that should concern anyone that's going through an AI implementation, because if you're a leader making an AI investment right now, you have to think about, well, how's this going to affect my business, both in terms of costs, long-term risk, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to get to that here with our guest. We're going to dive into this in a lot more detail. But speaking of AI, and before I get to the guest, one other thing that's really interesting, this is an article that just recently was published in VB VentureBeat Weekly. So venturebeat.com is the website. And this was just published a few days ago. And the headline is, enterprises with AI context layers report agent failures at more than twice the rate of those without one. So in other words, the cure in some cases for trying to put more governance in place for AI, the cure is actually making things worse in some cases, according to this article and this research. So what the article says is that a company that builds a governed context layer specifically to stop its AI agents from confidently giving wrong answers, the companies that do so, that implement these tools, are more than twice as likely to report the failure happening, not less. So I don't know if that's because there's more transparency and they see the failure, and so they're reporting it as a result of these context layers, or if it's the context layers themselves causing the problems. I'm not 100% clear on that, but it is a challenge either way. But according to this article, in the last 6 months, 68% of enterprises have traced a confident but wrong AI agent answer to missing or inconsistent business context. 37% said it happened more than once, ahead of the 32% who only saw it happen once. And this is coming from a VentureBeat Pulse July 2026 survey of 101 qualified enterprises with more than 100 employees. And that number, that 68%, is up from 57% in the survey, that same survey in June. So the recurring failures are climbing, according to the survey, going from 31% to 37%. So the numbers are not encouraging. It looks like things are getting worse for organizations. Now, it could be that organizations are getting further into their journeys, and so the failures are getting exposed more. So it's hard to say if the failures themselves are actually increasing, or if it's just more, you're starting to see more attempted adoption, which is then leading to higher failure rates. That part I don't know, but it is interesting. It just goes to show that when we're looking at some of these AI tools, it's not a surefire thing. It's not something you'd be 100% confident in. There's still a lot to be proven with this technology. It's still not mature at scale anyway. I mean, I think it's mature at the individual level potentially, or even then there's a lot of maturing it needs to do. But you think about all the hallucinations and issues that we all have at a personal level with AI, multiply that by hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees in an organization, and you can see how those challenges and those issues would just proliferate into a bunch of challenges. So that's something that is worth noting and something to think about. And when we have our guest here on in just a moment, we're going to talk about AI governance and procurement, cost commitments, risk, all that stuff that is so relevant here. And then one last thing around AI, just another newsworthy topic that's worth talking about, is that according to KPMG, their Q2 2026 global AI pulse of 2,100 leaders across 20 countries, they found that 49% of executives pulled back agent rollouts when costs outweighed expected value, and only 26% have cost visibility at scale. So in other words, 74% of organizations are using AI without any sort of cost visibility, which should be concerning to any organization, especially when we get to our guest topic here today, which is the hidden risks, the hidden costs, tokenization, consumption-based pricing, all the things that are going to cause AI costs to go up and potentially skyrocket in the years to come. Without that visibility, we're making a lot of commitments long-term right now without knowing it. And we're also creating a vendor lock situation right now without necessarily knowing it. So there's a lot at stake here. There's a lot to think about, a lot that organizations aren't yet realizing in terms of the cost commitment to the long-term risks of the decisions they're making right now. And in addition to that, Deloitte had a survey of over 500 tech leaders that found that only 15% have scaled multi-agent systems, with most citing an absent unified data foundation, inability to govern agents, and integration costs. So they cite those as some of the challenges that organizations are facing. So there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack here in terms of the challenges that organizations are having. And back in episode 280 of this podcast, we talked about, the uncertainty here and the lack of business value that organizations are facing. And here's some more data to back that hypothesis that we talked about several episodes ago. So 15%, only 15% have scaled multi-agent systems, and most cite absent unified data, inability to govern, and integration costs as some of the challenges there. So stuff that should be concerning, and some stuff you should be thinking about if you're an organization thinking about going through a digital transformation or any sort of AI initiative like that. So that's what we've got as far as the opening newsworthy topics, but I'm excited to bring our guest on here in just a moment. His name is Scott Bickley. He's with Infotech Research Group. We're going to have him on the show to talk about AI software contracts, tokenization, cost, risk, ROI, if there is any ROI to be had. We're going to talk about all kinds of AI stuff. He's a guy, by the way, I'll let him introduce himself when we bring him on here in just a moment, but he's a guy that's helping clients every day negotiate contracts and make commitments with their AI spend. And he's on the sort of the front lines of seeing these decisions get made and these contracts get signed. And so he'll have a really unique perspective. I'm excited to have him on the show. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave phase zero without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode.
Here comes all those fantasies, taking me to my room.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 287. My name is Eric Kimberling. I've been in the digital transformation space now for about 30 years, and I'm also the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients with their digital transformations. And my next guest on the show, or our first guest for today, I should say, is Scott Bickley. He's an advisory fellow at Infotech Research Group, where he leads the vendor cost and contract optimization practice. Now, Scott lives on the business side of IT. He handles sourcing, negotiations, terms and conditions, and other aspects of contracting and procurement. He's been knee deep in the economics of generative AI since it started, asking a question that most people skip, which is where's the demand actually coming from and who ends up paying as it relates to AI. Well, we're going to get into what a token actually is, why output tokens cost 3 times what input tokens cost, and why agentic workflows are where costs go off the charts, and the contract lever that almost no one has closed, which is the vendor's ability to quietly change how many credits a unit of work costs. So we're going to jump into all this here with Scott. And by the way, Scott is going to be at our Digital Stratosphere conference coming up in Denver in September 9th through 11th. You can learn more about that at stratosphere2026.com. But before that, obviously, before you attend the event, we'd love to introduce Scott here on the show. So Scott, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Eric. Nice to be here again. Looks like we got 2 for the price of 1.
Yeah, you got your dog here too.
My cat Kylo decided to join in.
What's your cat's name?
Kylo.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Kylo's I'm sure going to have a lot to say about this as well.
Yeah, he likes to be a part of anything on video. It seems like he finds his way in, breaks through the doors. But thanks for having me back, Eric. Look forward to jumping in on all of this AI stuff going on.
Absolutely, and this is not your first time on the show, but I think it's your first time talking about this particular topic. So it's a little bit different than what you and I have talked about in the past. And by the way, just before we get into intros and get into the substance of the conversation, Scott is going to be at our Digital Stratosphere conference coming up here in September. So if you are not already registered, if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to put up a QR code on the screen right now. You can see it on the right here, upper left corner of your screen. If you just scan that QR code, you can learn more about the event. You can also buy passes there. You can join in person in Denver, which is ideal, or you can join virtually as well. So we have a lot of people throughout the world that join that can't be here in Denver. But feel free to join. We'd love to see you there September 9th through 11th. We're going to have a lot of great speakers, including Scott, myself, and others. So be sure to check that out. But before we jump into some of the topic or some of the conversation I want to get to here today, Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself and about Infotech, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'm Scott Bickley. I'm an advisory fellow at Infotech Research Group. Been an analyst and practice lead over there for about the last 10 and a half years. We run a practice called the vendor cost and contract optimization practice. And basically we help our clients with the business side of IT. How do you think about budgeting for different technologies, the sourcing, the contract terms and conditions, negotiations with vendors in the space, and overall setting up kind of statements of work and your overall project structures for success. And this is part of our overall practice or overall company, which covers holistically the IT research and advisory space. So broader practices across CIO, applications, security, data and analytics, AI, of course. And so, we're just an arm of that and try to cover kind of the business side of the IT world.
Nice. So you're seeing a lot of front end procurement decisions being made right now as it relates to AI and things that are, I assume, going to affect these organizations for years, if not decades, to come.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because this has been going on for a few years now, right? Like we've been talking about, especially generative AI, but that kicked off kind of AI in general for at least the last 2.5 going on 3 years. And I've been hip deep into this space, looking at the economics, looking at kind of the business models for some time and wondering where is the call demand coming from. And we lived in an era of AI subsidies for the past couple of years where everything's been kind of provided on a per user per month basis or a subscription basis. Very easy to kind of throw some extra dollars at it and go to the all you can eat buffet. It's kind of like the old Vegas steak and egg breakfast for $1.99, but stay at our casino.
Right.
And that switch got flipped violently from off to on, from an AI subsidy to a consumption-based model. And very quickly, the calls started rolling in because the bills started rolling in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And tell us about that. I mean, what are some of the surprises that clients are seeing or feeling right now?
Yeah, and I think we've been in this era. So one of the things we talk about is kind of the AI bubble, right? And when I talk about an AI bubble, I talk about it from a market, an economic markets perspective, and not because we're giving financial advice or picking stocks or anything like that, but everything that gets driven from a fundraising and liquidity perspective in the market is what drives the downstream economics to buyers and consumers of the technology itself. And so really you kind of need about 6 different criteria to look at to say, are we in a bubble? And one of them is a transformational technology, and AI is definitely transformational. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. You also need that to be coupled with speculative, exuberant behavior, some crazy financing where you start getting like these circular vendor financing deals between NVIDIA and hyperscalers and chip producers or neo clouds, and then the model providers themselves, OpenAI and Anthropic primarily, and you start to kind of get really big valuations for companies that don't really produce a meaningful product yet. And then lastly, you get the famous 4 words: "This time is different."
So what Scott said is really important here because it's the lens for the whole remainder of the conversation and the rest of this episode. Scott isn't calling a bubble to give you stock advice. He's calling it because a bubble, economics upstream determine what you pay downstream. So here's a few things that you want to think about as you think about it here. So one is a genuinely transformational technology. AI qualifies for this. No one seriously disagrees. But 2, you look at speculative, exuberant behavior. Boards and CEOs going top down with adopt AI now, we're behind. That's FOMO, and it's manufactured. We've seen it before. We saw it with the cloud. We saw it with Y2K. We've seen it in other boom and bust cycles in the tech space. So it's nothing new. It's manufactured FOMO, and that part is manufactured. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the AI tools themselves aren't genuinely transformational, because they are, but I think where things are getting real dangerous is the fact that you've got a combination of something that can be transformational if you're smart about it. Now you're adding the speculative, exuberant behavior and the FOMO, the manufactured FOMO, and it's causing the hype to spiral out of control, in my opinion. So the third thing is strange financing. There's circular deals between chip makers, hyperscalers, the neo clouds, and the model providers themselves, and everybody's investing in everybody else's revenue. So it's sort of masking the underlying economics and reality of these investments that organizations are making. Now, fourth is enormous valuations attached to companies that don't yet produce a meaningful, profitable product. So you think about all these AI companies like Anthropic and OpenAI and all these others. They're generating huge amounts of revenue, but their spend is just off the charts. And you heard Scott talk about that here, and we'll continue to talk about that here in just a minute. But the valuations are not, in my opinion, justifiable by any sort of profitable economics yet. Eventually, maybe some of them will demonstrate that, but I think there's probably going to have to be some fallout and some losers along the way. I think you are going to have to see some sort of shakeout here because the spend isn't sustainable. So at some point, the arms race is going to be won by someone, and someone's going to lose. And who loses and wins, we don't know. We're all speculating at this point. So the fifth thing to think about is the escalation ladder. So this is when it started really with the hyperscalers spending free cash flow, which is safe. You can turn that off and the core business is fine. But then it moved to debt and equity issues. So now it's off balance sheet structures, privately held debt getting securitized and sliced into tranches. And Scott's comparison isn't .com, it's 2007 to 2008 housing with GPUs and data centers instead of houses. So it looks a lot like the mortgage housing bubble of 2007 to 8, just in a different industry here. And then the sixth thing is this concept of this time it's different. We've heard this before too. You heard it with the cloud, you heard it with, the latest version of whatever ERP vendor you use. You hear it all the time. So this time it's different. This is better. We failed in the past, or our software may have sucked in the past, but this new version, this is going to be different. And so you're in this endless cycle of trying to prove that things are going to be different when in fact they typically aren't. So when you start hearing that, that's when there's trouble ahead. And why should this matter? Is because there's $2.5 trillion that needs to be monetized, and the pressure is going to come from somewhere. It's going to typically get passed downhill or downstream to your renewal, to your consumption rate, and to your hardware quote. And so understanding the bubble isn't market opinion. It's not really investment advice in terms of stocks and whatnot. It's about negotiating context and really understanding the decisions that your organization is making long term, that's going to have long term implications on your organization in terms of cost and risk.
You kind of know, okay, the market's in a bubble. And so when the market's in the bubble, what happens is companies, specifically two companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, they have a need and a desire to bring their companies public in this market space. And then by going public, bring in a lot of liquidity and funding that they desperately need to fund these commitments and these backlogs that they've been talking about for the last few years. And so when you look at kind of the whole, universe of what this looks like, it started off pretty benign. The hyperscalers were funding a lot of this development through free cash flow on their balance sheets. And they generate, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of free cash flow. So, and it, you can turn that switch on, you can turn that switch off. Their core business doesn't change. They can afford that. Then we moved into, we're raising money in the debt markets, or we're issuing more stock and equity. And then you move to, we're doing these off balance sheet deals where we have a third party, and you kind of get funded by the, NVIDIAs of the world. The hyperscalers have a role, and then, other neo cloud providers and model providers come into play. And what really stacks up now is you've got about, on the debt side of the equation, about $1.2+ trillion of on balance sheet debt. That's in addition to all of their free cash flow being spent, right? Every penny.
Yeah.
And you've got about 1.4 trillion of off balance sheet obligations and debt, right? So this thing has now become crazy. So now the need and the pressure to monetize that is desperate. Ironically, SpaceX sucked the oxygen out of the room, right? Like they front ran OpenAI and Anthropic and got public before either of them had a chance to do that. And by doing so, they took $85 billion out of the market and onto their balance sheet, right? That's what they're trying to do. And so in doing that, they flip that switch to a consumption-based license model, and they start cranking up the revenue machine, right? And I would argue, even moving to consumption licensing, they're still subsidizing the cost of these tokens to some degree.
Yeah.
So, you've had the C-suite and the board of directors basically going top down to the organization. You have to adopt AI now. You have to adopt AI now. We're behind. They've created part of the FOMO and speculative behavior that we talked about as one of the bubble characteristics. And so that flows through the organization. Everyone starts panicking and thinking, we need AI, we need AI. They start throwing Copilot out and ChatGPT and Claude. They start using code assistants. They start figuring out how we're going to embed AI into our workflows. And this switch gets flipped. And all of a sudden, the CFO is getting a bill for $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000. And they're saying, what in the heck is going on? We have to do something. We have to do something now, or I have to shut this down. And
right.
That creates a tension, a big tension.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I've always thought, and I am not familiar with the numbers you just shared. So that is staggering. I mean, the fact that you're talking about trillions of dollars that needs to be, someone's going to pay for that, right? I mean, it's not just a bunch of rich billionaires that just have this money. We're talking about a whole nother magnitude of scale and debt that these companies are incurring. And so who's going to pay for all this? I think you're answering the question right now. The customers are going to pay for this somehow.
They're going to pay for it somehow. It's interesting, right? And typically in these cycles, there is a lot of capital that gets incinerated. Like it literally just gets written down and written off. We saw that in .com bust. I saw that firsthand as a contractor at Lucent back in the day. We saw that with the 07, 08 housing crisis. And I would say this bubble more approximates that in terms of its market structure than it does the .com bubble. These are GPU asset-based purchases. They're AI data center power and infrastructure being built. Like take houses and put it into the AI data center space, and then mirror in all of the shenanigans that happened during that time, all the way to today, where you're taking these privately held debt obligations and starting to securitize them and break them up into tranches and sell them off. And so really who pays for this at the end of the day? The big cohort that will pay the price, even more than IT consumers, will be retail investors, right? Because most people just dutifully put a percentage of their pay into their 401k or their pension plans every paycheck, not realizing that 40% of the S&P 500's value is concentrated in 10 stocks that are all based on this AI trade. Most people don't realize that in the private markets, these companies are investing in pension funds and insurance funds are taking investments in this space. So that's kind of where the carnage takes place if there's an event that causes a catastrophic crash. And it doesn't mean it has to crash either. Like there's a lot of different ways this could play out. But at the end of the day, in our world, yes, we will all be paying more for AI, at least in the short term. I think longer term, you take a 5+ year horizon, prices will cycle up. We've got everything is constrained from a supply chain capacity, right? Chips are constrained. Memory right now is definitely constrained. The ability to secure energy supplies. You've got, data center constraints to be built. I mean, all of this stuff is causing prices to stay elevated. Eventually, I think the models, and tokens themselves kind of become more commodity at some point. But we're a ways away from that point, no matter what happens today. And this is what you have to prepare for in terms of, how are you going to pay for this? What are you paying for? Like, how are you evaluating what you need to buy? Like, there's a lot of questions that now stem from just getting us to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to the audience real quickly too, and I've got a follow-up question on that point there. But Sanjay on LinkedIn says hello all. Hello Sanjay, thanks for being here. Elena on LinkedIn, hello, thanks for being here. And then Sanjay on LinkedIn asks the question here: how do the companies prepare when the AI bubble is going to burst? Assuming it does burst, or it might burst. Let's just say it might burst. So what should a leader do? I know you talked about there's a whole other issue here, which is we have stocks. We may not know it, but we have stocks and 401ks and retirement accounts that are sitting in these stocks that are exposed to a potential AI bubble. But let's talk about the companies themselves and the teams. How do they prepare for this?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that question. The biggest one that I think Sanjay is alluding to is, and I don't think you need to think of it as, I don't think you need to worry about when this bubble is going to burst. I think what the fact that we've created this bubble has done has taken people away from rational thinking, right? So we used to have this thing. If you're old like me and you go way back in time, there's the book by Jeffrey Moore called Crossing the Chasm.
I love that.
It talks about the technology adoption life cycle. And what this FOMO has done is pushed everyone to the front end of that curve and made everyone think that they're an innovator or that they're an early adopter. And the reality is most organizations are not. Most organizations probably struggle with crossing that chasm and being a fast follower. I would say a lot of us are late majority, even laggards in terms of technology adoption. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's all unique to your organization, your culture, the industry you're in should drive when and to what extent you adopt new technologies in general, AI chief among them. So what I would say is, this awareness should give you as a CIO, as a CFO, the ability to kind of take a breath, zoom out a little bit. Let's reevaluate. AI is going to have a place in your organization, but what should that look like? Where's that in, whatever you're going to be prepared to invest in those initiatives, what does that look like, and what value are you going to get out of this potentially? And then really start to look at where the technology is at today versus what you have expectations against from a value perspective or a business transformation perspective, to see where you should be. Most organizations probably should be much earlier in the exploration and discovery process, and thinking about how you're going to manage this culturally and from a governance perspective. And not to say that you're not going to give people tools and you're not going to start down the path today, but to think that you have to jump in the pool and get head deep underwater today is probably the biggest error that can still be corrected.
So Scott just had a really good point there. You have to adopt AI right now, or you'll fall behind. That's something that's FOMO at its finest. And Scott just made a point that reframed this whole conversation for me. And he used a book that's one of my personal favorites, and that's Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Now, Jeffrey Moore in his book talks about technology adoption lifecycle and how it runs from innovators and early adopters across the chasm to early majority, late majority, and laggards. And here's what the AI FOMO has done. It's convinced every single organization that it belongs at the very front of that curve. And everyone now thinks they're an innovator because they have a tool that could potentially, in theory, make them an innovator. The reality though, is that most organizations are not. Statistically, most of you are early or late majority, and some of you might be laggards, and that's okay. I don't use that as a judging sort of phrase. If you're a laggard, you're a laggard. It's okay. It means you're conservative. It means you are arguably smarter than some organizations because you're, for whatever reason, the industry you might be in is it's justifiable. But wherever you are, in most of you are going to be in that early or late majority, and some of you are going to be laggards. And so it's not a bad thing, but where you should sit on that curve is a function of your culture, your industry, your regulatory exposure, your risk tolerance, not a function of what your competitor posts on LinkedIn or what your software vendors convince you that you should be. So, I've talked about how I admit I've fallen into this myself, especially with AI, because we're a knowledge business. I see the real value, but there is some FOMO that even I've fallen into, being in this space, knowing the FOMO is a thing. I still, if I am being objective, can look at myself and our company, and at times we've fallen into the same thing, especially being in a knowledge-based industry. So I think that the lesson here for executives and leaders is that you have permission, you have a right. It's your organization, so you can zoom out, you can take a breath, you can reevaluate. AI is going to have a place in your organization in some way long term, but having a place maybe someday and jumping into the pool head deep today are two very different things and two different decisions. And so, the AI organizations and all the hype behind it would love to see you jump head first into the whole doubling down on AI and whatever the latest technology might be at any given time. But most organizations should be a lot more focused on exploration and discovery and being smart about it. And also, when you think about governance and culture, those are the things you want to make sure those foundational things are in place, just like you would any other technology initiative. So you want to make sure you're not operating out of a manufactured sense of urgency or panic or fear, which is where a lot of these irrational buying decisions come from. So, I think that's one of the big takeaways here from Scott is that you have time. AI is going to be around for a long time. If you don't adopt it now, it's okay. Or you can dip your toes into it without necessarily having to double down and lock yourselves into some sort of contract that doesn't make sense longer term. So we're going to continue the conversation here. We've got a lot more to cover with Scott. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I met her in a club down in Old Soho, where you drink champagne and it tastes like Coca-Cola. C-O-L-A.
One of the best ways to ensure digital transformation success is to learn from the lessons and failures of others that have been through similar engagements. And that's exactly what we'll do at the Digital Stratosphere Conference coming up in September 9 through 11 in Denver, Colorado. Now at this event, we're going to have a number of different speakers, different thought leaders in the industry. We'll have software vendors there. I'll be there. I'm going to be presenting my new book and giving a presentation about this book. I'll be signing the book as well. And we have a number of other speakers, a lot of well-known speakers that'll be there to share their lessons. Networking is amazing. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of good education that comes out of it. It's packed full of stuff. And register now. I've included links below. It's September 9th through 11th. I hope to see you there. It's in Denver, Colorado. You can buy a virtual pass or you can be there in person. So be sure to check it out. Hope to see you there.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, number 287. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this is the tech agnostic podcast that covers everything you need to know about digital transformation. And we're here with Scott Bickley. We're talking about AI, tokenization, cost, ROI, all the good stuff you need to know as you think about your AI journey. You know, you and I, right before we went live here in this interview, we were talking behind the scenes here about how, you know, the technology may look different, but this looks a lot similar to some of the cycles you were just talking about, Y2K and 2008. You know, we've seen these booms and busts and the whole mentality of, well, this time it's different. AI is different. Well, yeah, sort of, but not really, because corporations in some ways are repeating the same patterns, but just maybe on a more extreme basis. So I'd argue it's the same, but worse, you know, here without necessarily the upside benefit yet. We haven't seen the upside benefit of AI yet in any material way, I would argue. So we're spending all this money. You just talked about the trillions of dollars that are being incurred that maybe might deliver value. We think it will, but we don't know.
Now, there's another downside that, you know, that is real. And I think everyone's struggling with this other aspect of the bubble, which is, you know, because of this supply chain glut and the craziness that's occurred with, you know, chip production at the fab level, memory production, there is a legitimate, you know, exponential price increase that we've seen in hardware. So servers, PCs, device. I mean, you're seeing even consumer devices, Apple and Samsung raising prices on their devices. And Apple really doesn't like to do that. So, you know, it's bad when they have to do that.
Right.
It's like not good, right? And yeah, I mean, I'm looking at clients saying, hey, you know, this was, you know, a $30,000 quote, you know, last year, and now it's $300,000. And, you know, what do we do about that? And that's driving some interesting conversations because, you know, I do think at some point this crests and comes back down, and these are commodity cycles. They kind of go up very fast, they correct very fast, but hard to estimate exactly when those corrections are going to happen. And I think the next 12 months for sure are going to be elevated in prices. So we're starting to see people start thinking about, do we defer PC refreshes? Hey, I've got a data center, you know, cluster that needs to be refreshed. What do we do here? Do we move this to the cloud? Are we going to refresh this? Are we going to move to different software? Like a lot of different decisions are being driven just by the magnitude of the price increase that we're seeing on the hardware side of the equation. That actually, I would say, is probably the hidden danger. When everyone's over here looking at, you know, AI consumption costs, you can turn that switch off, and I guarantee you, your business is not going to miss a beat. You're going to keep going back to what you were doing. You know, you're still okay if you turn that switch off.
So Scott brings up a really good point here, which is that everyone is staring at AI consumption costs. The bigger exposure is your hardware budget. So if you think about this asymmetry, it's really interesting. AI consumption is discretionary. And Scott just put it bluntly. You said you can turn that switch off, and I guarantee your business doesn't miss a beat. You go back to doing what you're doing last year. It's uncomfortable, it's unpopular, but it's survivable. But hardware isn't like that unless you're already entirely in the cloud. You have servers to refresh, clusters to replace, PCs to cycle. And that spend isn't optional. And the AI build out has blown up the price of every component in it. Chips are constrained, memory is severely constrained, energy and data center capacity are constrained. And Scott is seeing clients with a $30,000 quote from last year that now comes in at $300,000. Apple and Samsung are considering raising consumer prices, and Apple hates doing that. So you know that the inputs and the supply chain costs are getting ugly at this point. So that's what's really reshaping real decisions right now is, do we defer the PC refresh? Do we move that cluster to the cloud instead of refreshing it? Do we switch software rather than buying iron? Here's the nuance though. These are commodity cycles. They spike fast and they correct fast. memory is the most volatile tech commodity there is. And Scott gives a signpost that's worth watching. A few months ago, the big three memory makers, Micron, SK Hynix, and Samsung, refused long-term agreements because prices were climbing daily. Now they're signing multi-year deals, and that's them locking in revenue because they see the craziness. New capacity just typically comes from coming online right when those committed orders flow through, and that's when price inflects down hard. So when you look at this, you have to stop and think that when, quote unquote, is unknowable, and the next 12 months look elevated. So the practical move is to stop optimizing pennies on tokens until you've stress tested your hardware roadmap, and that's where the money actually is.
You're going to have some hardware needs, right? Unless you're completely already in the cloud, you're going to have some impact there. So you might want to focus on that first.
Yeah, that's a good point. I love that comment you just made, which is you're going to be okay. I think there's this, you mentioned FOMO before. You just said it here or alluded to it here in terms of you're going to be okay. I mean, I know and I've been guilty of this as well in the consulting industry, being exposed to AI with our clients, internally. I've fallen victim to this in some ways where I've said, look, we've got to adopt AI. Now, to be fair, I think it's more because we're a knowledge-based company, and I see the value for us there. But I do fall into that FOMO cycle for sure, because you feel like, okay, I don't want to fall behind. I don't want to be the last guy in the consulting industry to adopt AI. And I think a lot of people are thinking that.
That brings up a great topic as well. Is like, there's levels of implementation or integration of AI within the organization. Like, I think you and I, and probably in our worlds, at the personal productivity level, the benefits are real and immediate to a large degree. Like, I could tell you, if you try to take my Claude away and I have to make a PowerPoint slide by hand again, we're probably going to have some words. It's not going to be true.
I know that has been one of the benefits of AI. Right? So you don't have to do a PowerPoint anymore.
And that's a real productivity. That's a real throughput enhancer for our organization. And I can show them, hey, I can bring content to life faster and free up time that I can do more client calls. I can add more value to our clients. Like, I can make a business case for giving me access to these tools. But a lot of clients that I'm talking to, they're starting at that personal productivity level and they're looking at it kind of one-dimensionally. And I'm like, wait a minute, why are you trying to get Copilot or Claude for 10,000 people? Are you looking at people by role, and where do they have a need for these tools in their day-to-day workflows? Like, if you're doing something transactionally in an ERP system, you whatever comes free with Copilot, if you're getting those licenses, is probably sufficient for someone processing AP invoices or something like that. Maybe they summarize some emails here and there. They're not doing things that require advanced, expensive functionality. As you move up the knowledge stack, then you're going to have those use cases that demand it more. And then, of course, when you get kind of to the top of that stack, your development teams and things like that, or that are using code assistants, those are big time token gobblers, right? The cost curve goes exponential. That's where you really need to be thinking about, okay, we need to understand our software development lifecycle process, the benefits, how we're going to manage this culturally, how we're going to communicate and measure, our quality levels, our throughput levels, all of those things. But so it can creep into the organization, through that door, and then you have more of the enterprise initiative. Hey, we want to start transforming workflows, or we've got this idea and we want to bolt on this AI solution and integrate it to our enterprise workflow. And that's where you kind of have to be really careful, because you're going to start messing with the underlying mechanics of the business. And if you're doing this in a piecemeal manner instead of looking holistically at your whole business, that strategy may be premature. It might be work that you have to go back and unwind and redo later on.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to say hello to Lean on LinkedIn, joining from the Netherlands. Hello, thanks for being here today. Scott on LinkedIn says Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. Good stuff. I love the book as well. I think it's an excellent book. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it as well. It's definitely my top 5 favorite business books of all time. Sarbjeet on LinkedIn says that's good advice. Dip your toes before you start swimming in deep waters. And then Jason on LinkedIn says everyone has been thrust to the bleeding edge with the opportunity to fail much more than in past innovation cycles. One thing I was going to ask you too, just to back up for a second, we've talked about how the cost, we've talked about FOMO and how there's questionable business value, and we still have a lot yet to prove, as corporate, in the corporate world, we have a lot left to prove in terms of how AI can benefit an organization at scale to justify the cost. But let's go back to the cost side. You were talking about the trillions of dollars that are sitting on balance sheets and off balance sheets for these big tech providers that are investing so heavily in these big data centers, knowing that somewhere along the way, they're going to have to monetize this. They're going to have to recoup those costs. So going back to that point, can we come back to the concept of tokenization? If you could you just explain, like in a real simple layman term way, what is tokenization and how does that translate to potentially increased cost for an organization?
Yeah. So if you think about tokens themselves, like token is the atomic unit of AI, right? So the way we think about bits and bytes are, comprising our digital information. The token is kind of the anchor for generative AI anyway. And so it's, energy is the fuel that these GPUs run on large language models, and then token is the unit of measure that we use to measure output. You could say a token is roughly equivalent to 3/4 of a word, if you will. And so basically, that energy gets produced, converted into a token. That token gets a price attached to it. There's a production cost, and then there's a cost that we pay. And it's all based upon, large language models. And those models have a ton of differences and diversity in terms of, the type of work they do, how much work they can do and at one time, if the complexity of the problems they can solve or claim to be able to solve. And as you kind of go up the stack to what they call frontier models, or you think your latest and greatest models, it's like if you're a person that likes to get new cars all the time, this is like, okay, this year I'm going to get my new Tesla. Okay, this is it's going to cost you this premium price. It's the new car with all the bells and whistles. Those are the frontier models. As new frontier models emerge, legacy models start to come down in price, and then you have a whole burgeoning universe of what's called, open weight models or open source models. And these are, a lot of them are born in China, not all of them, some of them in the States as well. But that, kind of brings to bear a different lower cost variant. But basically, tokens are your unit of currency. And that's where you're basically going to be, consuming. That's the consumption metric at the end of the day. Now, it might not be, if you're purchasing directly from Anthropic, for example, or OpenAI, it's usually an API call back to their model, and then, it's token consumption. And that's what the meter is going to run against. And depending on, which model you're using, different rates for input tokens, which is when you put your prompt into the context window and tell it what you want it to do. There's a cost for input, and there's things to do to make that more efficient. And then, the model processes the request, gives you an output. That's what we call output token cost. Usually output token cost is 3 to 1 more expensive than input. But that's kind of the underlying mechanics of how it works. And if you're purchasing directly from the model providers, that's kind of what you'll be, metered on. If you're purchasing AI capabilities through, different platforms, or different applications or SaaS applications, that token metric's going to be abstracted away. Tokens are messy, they're hard to understand, and they're constantly moving target, right? So some of the things I like to do is kind of compare, this should be similar to cloud spend, and it's just tokens. Yes, to a large degree, there's a lot of similarities to cloud spend, but there's a lot of differences as well. You could put the same query 20 times into the same model, and it can burn 20 different levels of tokens to give you a different response. And that response may not be the same 20 times either. So there's a lot of variability in these models, and there's a lot of just complexity that we're at this point in time we're not going to be able to decipher exactly what's happening under the hood. It's kind of a bit of a mystery box under these models in terms of how the underlying algorithms work.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that companies are unknowingly signing a contract that's locking them into an open checkbook sort of spend that's very hard to understand? I mean, you mentioned it's hard to decipher what exactly you're consuming.
Yeah.
And even AI providers themselves may not fully understand it. I mean, they know what they consume after the fact, but in terms of what's going to get consumed as a transaction or as a query happens, you mentioned some good points here. In fact, we were just talking about creating PowerPoints. Like, how many times have you and I created PowerPoints where we revised it 20 times, or we started over to create the same deck because we didn't like the first one that came out? So you're completing the same transaction or the same task, but you might have consumed a ton of tokens that you're not even thinking about because you're not being charged yet for that. But are we unknowingly signing ourselves up for this open checkbook sort of spend that we're just not going to be able to control in the future? And how does it tie back to the procurement process if that's true?
Yeah, I'd say today, yes, and on multiple levels, right? So on one level is the contract itself. So maybe you try to start slow and you sign up for a hybrid plan. Here's a per user cost to access the platform. It comes with some entitlement of usage, and they don't tell you like it comes with 1 million tokens. They just say here's an approximate level of what you could do with this level of plan in a month. And then it's kind of your mileage might vary. And then if you hit that cap, I mean, you can have constraints on this, at least at a crude level in the admin consoles. But like if you then go over, the allotted capacity, then you go to the consumption, by the drink model, through an API call back to the model. Or, you may have agreements where you just commit. Okay, hey, we're going to buy $2 million worth of tokens for a year. And then we're going to start giving access out to our organization. And yeah, right now today, the vast majority of organizations, they're starting to give access to that type of model. And no one knows, what your task, like you figure out things if you're looking at the meter, and you might say, hey, okay, I need a frontier model to build the first pass at this deck. I'm asking it to do a lot of stuff. I'm throwing a lot of information at it. But then once I get the first pass and it's like 85% where I need it, I could probably do my tweaks at a lower level model and a much lower token burn rate and a much cheaper rate. But what most people probably do is, it's like, what do we default to? Well, no, I want the best car. I want the highest horsepower. Let's just keep it there. It'll just keep jamming it through. And, there's a lot of things that we can, talk about then, like, okay, how do you optimize these models? What do you need from a FinOps perspective to manage the spend? I would say if there's, bringing it back up, there's kind of three main levels that I look at, kind of mirrors the FinOps approach as well. But the first one is, like, I think the viewer just mentioned, when you're on the bleeding edge, and they had a comment around that. And I say, well, when you're on the bleeding edge, you're going to bleed a little. And,
right.
You're definitely going to bleed a little as you explore this new world and what consumption looks like for different use cases. And so you have to put, guardrails in place. Kind of step one when you do this is, what I call stop the bleeding. Put guardrails on it. We're going to put consumption caps. And, I'm going to probably set those caps pretty low to start, because, like, who's going to use this? Let's see what you're using it for. Let's actually kind of build some data and some telemetry before we start opening the guardrails up and losing control of things. That also kind of gives you an idea of different tasks and different things people are doing, if they add value and at what cost. This is well before you're even optimizing any of the spend. And then the second kind of phase is what I would call is you're optimizing the waste, right? So then you get to the point you're like, okay, well, people like it, we're getting value, we see good utility here, but we're burning through this 2 million in credits really quick. And then you start getting into what can we do? And depending on your use case, there's different things you can do. Obviously, where you're burning more tokens, like development activities, code assist, things like that, you want to focus more efforts. You're probably going to want some tooling. You may want an AI gateway or harness that allows you to do model routing and select the best, most efficient model for the job. You might want to look at things like caching, where you can hit the same store of data at a 90% lower cost than processing that data repeatedly every time you have a repeatable query in that world. You might look at things like prompt compression to take all the white space out of that prompt and inefficient format, convert it to something that's much more efficient to be processed by the model. There's dozens of things that you can do in that space that but they require technical skill. They may require some outside tooling or require you to build some tooling. And then there's things that you can do for like our day-to-day use of personal productivity, where through training and through just awareness, we can be better stewards of how we consume those resources. But by and large, our category of personal consumption, it can be, if you scale it out, you give this to thousands of people, it can add up really quick. But it's still proportionally small compared to things like multi-step chat that's actually doing coding, and you're building multiple agents that are out there building code. That's where the meter really starts to run. And then the really high end is when you start doing agentic workflows and you say, okay, we're going to start building agents into our workflows that are either autonomous or semi-autonomous, and they're starting to access different data stores and different process systems and different processes. That's where things literally go off the charts, right? Where you can go from thousands of tokens being consumed to hundreds of thousands or even millions, depending on what you're doing there. And that's where danger resides, right? So that's where, okay, you get things like, well, this workflow, I was unable to complete the workflow. I'm just going to keep trying, and it's called a retry storm, right? And maybe between the time you go home tonight, Eric, and you come back tomorrow, I've tried 1,000,000 times, and it's $100,000 in cost because I didn't have anything to stop me from retrying that task so many times. Take that scenario and then multiply it by a dozen examples your imagination can conjure up. It gets expensive really fast.
So based on what Scott just said, there's a practical playbook that we can apply here. First is we look at the vocabulary. A token is the atomic unit of AI, so roughly 3/4 of a word. Bits and bytes for the digital world, as he said. Tokens for generative AI. Energy is the fuel. Tokens are the beaters. Your prompt is the input tokens. The model response is output tokens, and output typically runs about 3 times more expensive than input. So frontier models are the brand new car with all the bells and whistles at a premium price. Legacy models get cheaper as new frontier models ship, and open weight models sit below that. And here's the part that breaks people's mental model as it relates to this, and that is that this is not cloud spend. In the cloud, the same query costs the same thing. With AI, you can run the identical query 20 times and burn 20 different amounts of tokens and get 20 very different answers, and the variability is just built into the model. So here are 3 phases you can think about in terms of this. Phase one is to stop the bleeding. You put guardrails and consumption caps in place, set deliberately low to start, and then you build the telemetry before you build the freedom. You learn who's actually using this for what and what cost. So as Scott said, on the bleeding edge, you're going to bleed a little, and that's fine, but you just don't want to hemorrhage. So those guardrails, the stopping the bleeding is an important phase one. Now the second phase is to optimize the waste. So you want to model the routing through an AI gateway so the cheapest capable model does the job. Caching, which can hit the same data store at up to 90% lower cost than reprocessing it every time. Prompt compression to strip out the inefficient formatting you're paying to tokenize, and plain user training. Use the frontier model for the first pass of the deck and then drop to a cheaper model for the tweaks. Most people don't do this. Most people park it on maximum horsepower and just leave it there. I know I'm guilty of this as well. And then the third phase is unit economics. So you want to tie business value back to spend. This is where you actually want to be, but you can't get there without the cross-functional team, the governance structure, and the tooling from phases 1 and 2. So one specific horror story that is worth internalizing here is the retry storm. An AI agent can't complete a workflow, so it keeps trying 1,000,000 times between when you go home and when you come back. And that's money that you're spending for zero output. personal productivity use adds up slowly. Code assistants burn hard, agentic workflows go off the charts, thousands of tokens become hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So put your guardrails where the meter actually runs, and that's what you want to focus on. And I think that's something that was super helpful for me to hear, and is helpful for me to hear, because I think a lot of leaders aren't doing this right now. And I think that's something we can all learn from. So good stuff from Scott, and I've got a lot more to cover with him. We're not done yet. We've got a lot more we don't want to dive into here. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey, or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave Phase Zero without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 287. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Scott Bickley. We're talking about AI consumption and tokenization and AI costs and governance and all the stuff that we're thinking about, or maybe we're not thinking about, but we should be as it relates to our AI initiatives. Back to the open checkbook concept. I mean, I have an unpredictable consumption model with no governance and no controls in place, and they're going to pay it either way. You know, and it's just crazy that I mean, it's a brilliant business model. I'm just surprised that so many organizations are signing contracts that are giving up that control.
Well, we go back to, earlier part of the conversation, right? We're and this is kind of the crux to my point of, we're in a bubble. The FOMO is real. The speculation's real. And it is powerful. It is powerful. And we see the power being translated into spend. I mean, if you look at, I think they use a annual run rate, which isn't a real metric in the finance world, but it's the guiding light that people are using today. But you've got OpenAI at somewhere north of 40 billion a year in run rate revenue, and I think yesterday they said Anthropic's around 65 billion. So right there, you've just plucked $100 billion from somewhere, and that's real spend, right? So maybe some of that, a lot of that's from the hyperscalers building capacity and pre-buying things, but a lot of that's trickling down, and it's from the enterprise, it's from the IT consumer. And that's where kind of that third pillar now in FinOps comes into play, which is the important one. But you have to crawl, walk, run to get to this pillar, which is, the unit economic value. How do you get to tie the business value back to the spend? But you can't skip the first two steps, right? You have to actually build the cross-functional teams, the governance structures, the tooling, the oversight. You have to think through what that should look like so that you can, build these AI capabilities in a calculated, mindful manner and get to a point where once you deploy them, you actually are able to see if they're valuable or not and if they have a positive ROI.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some interesting comments coming in on social media here. This is from Chris on LinkedIn. The whole thing won't show up on the screen here, but I'll read it. I use AI in my compliance engine. I compare procedures to regulatory standards. In my case, it did not take long to see how fast costs run up when using the engine. You must limit the number of scans a client can make. The use of AI for clients is like chocolate. Once you try it, you must have it. However, you can't have it every day. So it is an interesting point because as you were talking about annual recurring revenue and how there's tens of billions of annual recurring revenue that a lot of these AI providers are generating. And that's what investors want. They look at that and they say, okay, you've got 60 billion of ARR and that's good. Or, if that number goes up, that's a really good thing because that's predictable, it's stable, et cetera. So you've got that piece of it, which is I'd call it the actual monetization that's happening right now. But then you've also got this vendor lock concept. That's not what Chris doesn't mention that by name, but it's sort of like the chocolate concept. You try it, then you must have it. That's what I wonder about is like, you've got the cost that could go up over time, but then also you have to look at the switching cost. Like, am I going to be able to extract this AI tool out of my organization and get people to scale back once they've gotten a taste of it and once they get hooked on using it every day to do whatever they want? Are you then going to be able to throttle it back and say, oh, no, sorry, we got to cut back on that now because it's getting too expensive?
That's another multifaceted topic, but we have to talk about it because the one thing I'll say is like in any of these topics we talk about vendor lock-in a lot. Pretty much you're always going to be vendor locked to some extent. Like if you're using a vendor, you're locked. Like if you decide we're going to the cloud, I'm sorry, even if you take a prudent approach and you put 70% of your workloads in AWS and 30% in Azure. Okay, well, you're still locked. Like,
right.
You might be able to incrementally leverage the two between renewals and workload migrations and things like that. But, you're not putting 70% of your workload in the cloud so you can rip it out every 3 years. It's not that's not why we do these things. But it is important that you choose where you want the 70% to reside because you're going to have to live with that for a while. I would say the same is true with AI. And I think it comes down to a lot of, there's a few different factors here. One of the big ones to me is, are you going to build or are you going to buy? And build versus buy is a continuum. You talk about this a lot in the ERP world, right? You could buy and configure, you could buy and extend the platform, you could buy and still customize on top of it. There's a continuum there. But by and large, do you want to, are you a shop that's going to consume directly from the model providers themselves, and you're going to natively build these AI solutions, and these workflows in your environment, which comes with its own cost basis around talent and skills and technology? Or are you going to, hey, maybe, we're going to purchase from a platform provider, like within our cloud environment, we'll use models that Amazon provides and as well as the access to the major models, and that's a way that you can, you're still locked into Amazon, but you'll have choice for the models they offer, and you can diversify from the different AI providers, large language model providers within that cloud environment, as an example. You may have someone like Google's a full vertical stack, like from the hardware and their TPUs all the way up. There's certain companies that will want to say, yeah, we want to buy that whole stack. We're developing clinical drugs and we're going to put a cluster in, and it's cheaper to use Google TPUs, and we'll go that route. But most of us, I think, are probably going to live in consumption via the SaaS layer to some extent. All of the SaaS companies and for sure the mega vendors have been well on this path of integrating AI and AI agents into their workflows and into their products and into their commercial models. They've now layered in where, pretty much you're always paying, a hybrid model. You're still paying a per user per month fee for a seat license. And now you're also having a consumption component layered into that. And then there's probably other stuff that's already been there, where if you're adding extra support as a percentage of your spend and all of this other stuff that's crept in over the years. I think the majority of organizations are going to decide that, building is a big deal. And there's a lot of issues that lie under the tip of the iceberg around security and role-based access and identity and governance and regulatory compliance and data models and data governance. And it's like, hey, our data is always a mess, but at least it's the mess I know in ServiceNow or SAP, versus now I have to maintain, the data lake here in Snowflake or Databricks, and I have to, you're still, and there's probably a hybrid mix of how this happens, but by and large, where am I going to put the bulk of my investment in AI? Well, I'm probably going to do it in the systems of record that I'm already in. That's my take on this.
Well, talk about costs. I mean, part of that is what are you comfortable with? What do you have the internal competencies to support? And you've invested in a certain infrastructure, whether you like it or not. You've invested in a certain infrastructure over time, and to switch away from that, you've got to have a high threshold of justification for why you would do that.
And that is now, when you talk about lock-in, I'd say when you decide if that's the path you're going to take, you really need to look at your system of record vendor, and you need to take a second look right now, because once you start incorporating these AI capabilities and these commercial models on top of what you're already consuming from these vendors, that is definitely a deeper, stickier level of lock-in, especially if the AI works, right? Like if it actually delivers business value. Well, now you're going to have the ability to go very granular in terms of potential personalization and customization of workflows and the whole differentiation that you're looking for by employing these capabilities into your business processes. So if it adds value, then that leverage is accrued by the vendor. They're going to want to continue to commercialize and cash in on that as well. So you need to be thinking about what you need to do to protect yourself, both from a commercial terms perspective, pricing and all of the protections that should go with that. But also from a contractual terms and conditions perspective, because most of the terms we would want to address in an AI addendum or an agreement with these providers, they're completely silent on. They address them by not addressing them.
Yeah.
And so if the contract is silent, I get to choose to some degree how to interpret my rights within that agreement. And I'm probably going to interpret them to my benefit if I'm the vendor, in terms of what I can do with your data and how I can use it, and how I define inputs and outputs, and what you can do, what your license rights are as well. So a lot of factors there.
And once you're knee deep in it, with a vendor, whether it's your ERP vendor providing AI or whether it's a separate AI provider, once you're knee deep, you're committed. Even if you're comfortable with the cost structure, they let's just say they decide to raise it. I mean, you have to look at where the leverage is, not just contractually, but like in the relationship in general. Set aside the contracts for a minute, which is very important, but set it aside and you just look at what are you going to do? They raise the price and you don't like it. It's too expensive. What are you going to do? It gets to the point where it's like, well, this really sucks, but it's less crappy than ripping it out and replacing it with something new that maybe is cheaper. So
now they have two levers, right? So this is the trick, right? So they have, and this is why tokenization or AI credits or work units, whatever they want to call them, are a bit nefarious, because one is, okay, here's the price per credit. And so we're always going to want to go out, and get our discounted price per credit. That's, and they're always going to play the game, but you're going to see that pricing is already muted, right? So like where you might negotiate some, 70-80% discount on a seat for, a different SaaS vendor, for some of the big ERP solutions or something like that. They have an inflated list price, and you can negotiate down, quite a bit. Typically on these credits, you're talking smaller, shallower discounts. So maybe 10%, 20%, and kind of you're starting to hit caps pretty quick. The other lever, though, is how they compartmentalize units of work by these credits. So, how much work do I get for 5 credits or 100 credits or 200 credits? And they'll categorize these things, or they all have their own systems for how you can try to calculate what that looks like. That sits under a URL in the technical documentation that they can pull the lever on anytime they want. So they might say, we'll give you 50% discount on the credit. And they go back tonight and make twice the credits required to do the same unit of work. And that dial, I have not yet seen be controlled in the contracts at all. And so that then brings up kind of the evolution. So what we're talking about here is the evolution of software licensing, and eventually, what Salesforce is already talking about doing. I think that they put the cart in front of the horse way too often, but essentially outcome-based pricing, right? So how do I price an outcome?
So if there's one thing that Scott has shared with us that you might take into your next renewal, here's what I would suggest to you. If with AI credits, the vendor has 2 levers and you're probably only negotiating one of them. Lever 1 is the price per credit, and that's the one you'll fight over, and you should. But notice how muted the outcome is. On a traditional SASE, you might negotiate an 80% discount off an inflated list price. But on AI credit, Scott says you're looking at 10, maybe 20%, and you hit the ceiling fast. Lever 2 is the one that nobody closes. How much work a credit buys. How many credits does this task cost? 5, 100, 200? That mapping lives in a technical document behind a URL, and the vendor can change it anytime they want. So they can hand you a 50% discount on the credit at signing, and then double the credits required to do the same unit of work, and you've negotiated yourself exactly nothing. At the end of the day, the net result is nothing, because the vendor still has all the leverage. They have the power to price however they want to price the overall solution that they give you. So Scott says he's not yet seen that dial controlled in a contract, not once, which is really interesting because he does this for a living. This is all he does is help clients with their procurement and contracting decisions. So here's the ask, and it's real specific, and that is that get language that freezes the back-end unit of work calculations for the duration of your term, and fight for those protections at renewal too. You're not asking for a discount. You're asking for a discount you already negotiated to still mean something a year from now or however long from now. And then there's a couple other things you want to watch too, as Scott pointed out. One is that silence is a term. Most AI addendums are simply quiet on the issues you care about: data rights, how inputs and outputs are defined, what your license actually permits. And Scott's framing is right. They address them by not addressing them. And that's because when a contract is silent, the vendor gets to interpret what that means, and they're going to interpret in their own favor. And again, it gets back to the point I was making, is what are you going to do? The vendor has all the leverage. If they have all the leverage in the relationship, what are you going to do if they decide to raise the price, or if you end up paying a bit more or a lot more than you'd like to? The other thing to watch for, per Scott's suggestion here, is that the lock-in gets deeper if the AI works. So if you layer AI on your system of record and it genuinely delivers through granular personalization and customized workflows and real differentiation, all that leverage accrues to the vendor, and they'll keep commercializing it. So everyone's watching outcome-based pricing as the end game, and Salesforce is out front talking about it, but no one has really solved how you define an outcome or choose whose definition wins. So until then, you've got to protect the mechanics you can actually see. And to be fair to the vendors, the tokens are no simpler for them. They're managing margin against the same moving target. That's, however, not a reason to give them the dial. It's the reason to write it down and to negotiate it into your contract.
How do you define an outcome versus how do I define an outcome? What's a certain outcome, worth to me versus, 100 of my peer companies in my industry, and what's it worth to the vendor? And so it's not easy to get there. So in the meantime, I think you have to try to secure at least, some language that says, hey, we're not going to change the back end calculations on these things, through your term. Like, get some commitment that at least locks you in for that visibility. Try to get some protections on the renewal as well. But it's very hard because they're trying to figure it out as well. To be fair, they don't, tokens are no more simple for the vendors than they are for us. And they're dealing with the same moving target, except they're paying for these things. I'm sure they're paying in bulk, and they're paying, at a highly discounted rate from the model providers, but it's still a cost that they have to manage margin against. And so it's really messy right now. You're taking multiple, you're placing multiple bets when you decide to invest in this space right now. And especially if you're investing in it and putting critical workflows against this technology, things are going to change.
What I imagine a lot of people listening don't even realize the magnitude of the bet they're making. Or they don't even realize they're betting, whether it's as a business investing in AI tools or as a consumer who has money somehow tied up unknowingly in the AI space. A couple of comments I want to get to here on LinkedIn. Sarbeat says, completing 32 years in Silicon Valley, one of his barometers for tech bubbles is looking at the interstates in Silicon Valley. This is the third time he's seeing such tenseness. The first was the internet, second cloud, and now it's AI. Interesting barometers. I mean, sometimes you do look at things like, I think what was the word you used at the very beginning as far as the irrational exuberance? Was that the word?
I didn't use that one, but that applies. That works.
You said something like that. I mean, maybe I'm paraphrasing or picking a different phrase, but that is a lot of what we're seeing now. And I think sometimes you look at anecdotal examples like what Sarbeet's talking about it, and I think that's a good barometer of where we're at in the space. Scott on LinkedIn says asymmetric price transmission occurs when retail or downstream prices react differently to upstream cost increases than to cost decreases. The old rockets and feathers trick. I'm suggesting prices will drop very slowly as supply catches up with demand. I don't know. We have a lot of clients. One thing I didn't mention is we have a lot of clients in that are manufacturers that manufacture something that is a part of this big, massive data center build out wave that we're seeing. And it's driving prices up. You mentioned supply chain shortages and things of that nature, limited chips and limited supply. I mean, for the next few years, at least, I think those costs will continue going up just because there is such a shortage and there's such an arms race right now to build out those data centers as fast as possible.
Here's one signpost for you, Eric. I mean, if you look at memory, memory is the most volatile of all of the tech commodities. It always has been. And just a few months ago, the memory, there's basically it's like an oligopoly, right? It's Micron, SK Hynix, and Samsung are the big three players. And just a few months ago, they were saying, we're not doing long-term agreements because they were cashing in, man. This price was going up daily. Now, all of a sudden, they're entering into multi-year long-term agreements, right? So that right there's a signal. Hey, okay, we see craziness is happening. We want to make sure we secure this revenue stream. Now, that the problem is that means that, the commitment for that higher level of volume has been entered into the supply chain. So they're building new capacity. Typically what happens is the new capacity comes online at about the same time these orders start flowing through at mass. And then that's where you see, a change on the margin causes a very quick inflection down in price. But the question's when, that answer isn't available to us right now.
Yeah, we don't know for sure. Here's a comment from Jason on LinkedIn. Building will be a non-starter and unsustainable for the majority of organizations. That's back to the buy versus build conversation or thread that we were talking about here. Here was another question I want to get at. And this is actually the crux of what you do as a professional at Infotech. And this is from Jason on LinkedIn. He says, with contracts and tokenization driving wild swings in business case ROI, how are leading organizations looking at the governance of AI business cases? And I would say, let's look at it from both the cost and the benefit side of things. Are you seeing, let's start with procurement in the contracting side. How are you seeing best in class organizations or clients you advise? What are you advising them to do on the cost side, and what can they do on the benefit side, the ROI side of it?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this starts way before, we even get into the traditional cost benefit analysis or procurement type of tools that are brought to bear. And a lot of what our kind of AI center of excellence focuses on here is starting to really identify and methodically build out use cases that tie to the business strategy, that tie to the corporate vision and the outcomes you want for your business, not sub-optimizing for AI in a bubble. And then layering in what you need from a governance perspective, right? So what are your regulatory constraints? What do you need in terms of, to feel comfortable using this technology? What do you need the vendors to be able to do from, an explainability and a transparency perspective? How are you going to look at bias? How are you going to look at security? I mean, you've got all of these things that require work, you're also going to have underlying, we all talk about AI, but then we don't talk about the underlying data models and integration points and all of the IT infrastructure. You're now layering this on top or around all of that, and that cost doesn't go away. You have to integrate all of that into the business case. And so now, what does this team look like? There's a lot of different skills and resources that I need to bring to bear. There's different technologies that are going to need work done on them, as well as the cost of the AI solution itself. That all builds up to then being able to say, okay, now we've got a sense of scale, we've got a sense of expected benefit. Then we can move into kind of the sourcing phase. Well, what are available products and solutions on the market? And that's where we get into kind of what I look at as the 3 V's, which is vet, verify, and validate. So at that point now, I've got enough front end information to start looking at vendors and vetting them appropriately, right? So I want to vet them on on some basic criteria around. Pull up my little slide here. To the typical things, financial viability, right? If you're like a startup AI native vendor that's got $10 million in Series A financing, I don't know if I want to put my critical business process flow on your technology, no matter how great it looks today, right? But I want to look at financial, contract, risk aspects, performance, and then overall vendor relationship. Those are like our typical things we look at for any vendor. If you pass through that filter, then kind of verify that the technology does what it's supposed to do. How do we look at your models and how the models are trained and the evaluations of use cases and pilots? Is it explainable? Like if I'm putting something into my finance workflow, there's an article that came out, a study that was done on what it takes for these companies to verify the results AI is giving them. They're giving half of the benefit back in trying to verify the result, because you're an accountant, you can't just rubber stamp it an AI output. I've got to see the traceability and where did that come from? Where's the source data? So I need to have verification around that stuff, around data privacy, around all my governance and controls. And then I get to validation, which is, are you actually accomplishing what we want from a business outcome perspective? So there's a lot there, right? This is far cry from, hey, let's pull out, shoot from the hip and throw some AI on this business problem. There's a lot of work that needs to go into it. You need a lot of governance. You're going to need a FinOps, at least a FinOps capability, if not a dedicated team to kind of have an ongoing management of costs and visibility. If you're already in the cloud and you're spending a lot of money in the cloud and you don't have FinOps, you're already behind. You should have started there, so start there now. But this is kind of, because I think this is where things are going, right? Regardless of what happens with the bubble bursting or not bursting or whatever, I think we all agree there is a utility that is gained from AI. The question is, to what extent? Like I've got people telling me, oh, these large language models are going to cure cancer. And I'm like, really? Because I follow this MIT and NYU professor that's been in this space for decades saying the combination of large language models with neurosymbolic models creates the ability to do some math, but it's still a far cry from being able to be sentient or to be able to devise things outside of what we feed it. So you've got two camps around where's capability going to fall. I'm more on, I'll give you another example, quantum. Like we always talk about quantum. One of my colleagues, he's definitely a visionary, a really smart analyst. He thinks, well, quantum, like 3 years, we'll start breaking cryptographic hashes and things like that. And I'm like, it's 10 years. Every year it's 10 years. Like it's never,
Yeah, we never catch up to it.
I look at the progress and I see incremental. So like, where do you sit on that AI spectrum? How transformational do you think it will be? And how much of a bet are you willing to place? But if you're going to place a bet, it comes with all of that baggage.
Yeah. Yeah. And all that uncertainty too. And all that reality of you probably, or at least possibly being wrong on the bet too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you may, you have to be prepared to make that investment and realize, okay, this didn't work out as planned, or maybe there's unintended benefits or things that you find out along the way. It's not a total loss, but yeah, this is not, it's not a guarantee when you get to scale in core business processes.
Yeah. Well, I think, a good phrase that you said earlier today that I think is a great summary of everything we've talked about here today is that, if you're on the bleeding edge, you're going to bleed. I love that line. I might steal that from you because it's very true. And that's where we're at. We're on the bleeding edge right now. Back to Innovator's Dilemma. We are on the front end of that curve, and there's a lot of uncertainty. We're going to bleed. We're going to make mistakes. The question is, how do you position yourself to, at the very least, not set yourself up to make things worse, cost-wise, vendor lock-wise, risk-wise, all that stuff. And knowing that there's a lot we don't know, what sort of closing advice would you leave for leaders that are, about to embark, or they're early in their AI journeys, or they're just their overall technology investment journeys? Because I think this goes beyond AI, because AI is bleeding at everything right now. So in some way, it's affecting every technology decision we make right now.
Yep.
What sort of closing advice would you leave for someone who's just getting started on their journey?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, go back in time, read Crossing the Chasm, know who you are as an organization, right? That's got to be the first thing. You have an honest assessment of culturally, who are we as an organization? Hey, if you happen to be an innovator or early adopter, good. Then you can kind of take a more aggressive approach to how you adopt new technologies, including AI. The other thing I would say is kind of look at the use cases. There's different use cases that are lower risk, like can tolerate more error, right? Versus things that can tolerate very low errors, if any. And so look at things that are already, kind of being proven to be successful out there and see if that low-hanging fruit applies to your organization. If it does, start there, right? Let's do things that have already been done successfully. Let's get some quick wins under our belt. And let's use that as a springboard to build off of, to help then finance what you need from a governance perspective and from a tooling perspective to really put the right infrastructure, culturally and from a personnel perspective behind these initiatives. I think that that will put you on a path to success, and also set realistic expectations for the organization.
That's great. It's great advice. That little clip right there is worth gold. That little 2-minute summary. So thanks for that. And thanks, Scott. Really good conversation. Appreciate you being here today. Learn a lot from you as always. So thank you for that. And hopefully the audience learned a lot as well. By the way, thank you for all the great audience questions. There's some really good ones there that I had not thought of, but I found super helpful. So thank you for that. And we're going to come back here in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how AI is actually causing an increase in a proliferation of shadow IT. Now, it may sound counterintuitive. A lot of people would say, hey, no, that's not true. AI is not shadow IT. AI is eliminating shadow IT, as is modern ERP systems and other modern technologies. Well, I'm here to share with you how modern technology, including AI, is actually creating a ton of shadow IT at a scale we've never seen before. So stick around. I'm going to talk about what I mean by that. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
When the soul of the city was laid to rest, and the night's forgotten.
If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book, and it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons that could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry. engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 287. My name is Eric Kimberling, and you can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we've talked a lot in this episode about AI, right? Cutting edge, bleeding edge, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. There's a lot of potential. We hope that someday we'll get these costs under control. We'll start to see ROI. But let's look at another side of this, which is AI, along with other modern cloud and ERP technologies, is actually creating a whole new wave of shadow IT. And it may sound counterintuitive. It's not the cool, sexy thing to talk about, but it is something really important, worth talking about. I think it's extremely important because this is where organizations are failing to see the dark side and lift up the covers and look at the warts of what we're doing right now in this industry and the investments we're making. So I'm going to show you a YouTube video that I recently published that unpacks this argument in a bit more detail, and I'll be curious to get your feedback on this. So let's roll the clip and we'll come back and chat about it. How do we get rid of the spreadsheets, the one-off solutions, the custom-developed solutions, the unauthorized and unsanctioned apps within the organizations? These are a lot of the problems that IT leaders and executives are trying to solve with their digital transformations. However, despite the fact that we have AI now, we've got predictive analytics, we've got cloud solutions, modern technologies, despite that fact, shadow IT systems are going to get even worse in the 2020s, and there's a number of undercurrents that are pointing to a future where shadow IT becomes even more of a problem, and I'll explain why that is and what you can do about it here in today's video. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how to lead your digital transformation with success, be sure to check out our Executive's Guide to Digital Transformation. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. First, it helps to explore what exactly is shadow IT. Well, shadow IT is essentially a unsanctioned, under-the-radar sort of technology solution that is created by end users to solve a problem, to help them do their jobs in a way that perhaps their current technology stack can't support, and or perhaps they just don't know how to do their jobs using the technology they have. So what people will often do is they will create their own spreadsheets. They'll go out and acquire their own off-the-shelf software and just use it within their little work group without IT or the broader corporate office knowing what's happening. Today, with the advent of AI, we're seeing it in the form of artificial intelligence tools. You probably know people in your organization that have gone out and bought their own personal version of ChatGPT or Claude, and they might be using it to do their jobs because it makes their jobs easier and it solves a problem for them at their individual level. So think of shadow IT as something that is a solution that was created by end users and probably didn't have the support of your corporate office or your corporate IT department. And oftentimes corporate doesn't even know you're using that technology. So that's where the name shadow IT comes from, is because it's not part of the official IT stack, but it's something that people will use to help them do their jobs better, regardless of what limitations they might perceive with the sanctioned IT stack. And one important thing to note here is that it's easy to attack shadow IT as a problem, and as a root cause it needs to be eradicated. But the reality is in most cases, shadow IT is actually a symptom of something deeper. And that's what I'm going to talk about here today is what are those root causes? What are those things that cause organizations and individuals to want to use shadow IT systems? The first reason why I think the rise of shadow IT is only going to get worse in the years to come is because of the whole movement to the cloud. As we look to ERP systems and other types of enterprise technologies that are moving to a homogenized version of cloud solutions, they're oftentimes very standardized, they're oftentimes less flexible than their on-premise counterparts, and they're oftentimes evolving and changing in a way that may or may not align with the business needs and operational priorities that you have as an organization. So what's happening over time is that in the past, you always had the option to customize, change the software for better or for worse to keep up with your evolving business landscape. But now we're putting more of our technology in the hands of software vendors who are going to continue to innovate and change the software, which may or may not align with how our business runs in the future. And this is a dark side of cloud ERP systems that I think we have yet to fully experience, but it will come to light here in the next 5 to 10 years. And as part of that evolution and that drift away from how cloud technology works in the future and how your business needs to work in the future, that divergence between those two things is going to create a gap space for shadow IT. Now, in the past, traditionally what people have done when there's a deficiency with their core enterprise technologies, what they've done is they've gone and they've created a solution. It might be a spreadsheet, it might be an Access database, it might be a custom app. Whatever it is, there's a certain amount of ingenuity that goes into creating the solutions. Even if you want to call it technical debt or label it as something bad, it is something that's a solution for deficiencies in other parts of the enterprise tech space. So rather than thinking about shadow IT as a problem, it's more important to think about what is the root cause that's causing shadow IT to be the symptom. So what is that deeper cause? And a lot of times it's because there's limitations in our enterprise technology. Therefore, people are creating solutions and workarounds because the enterprise technology doesn't support that. Now, in today's day and age, you might be implementing a cloud ERP system as we speak, or maybe you recently implemented one. And perhaps it's a great fit. You're in sync with what that software does and what you need from it. But again, it's not today we're talking about. We're looking 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years out when the technology starts to drift, your business starts to drift into a different direction, and that chasm between what software does out of the box and what you need it to do, that only grows. And assuming you can't customize the way you could have customized in the past in an on-prem environment, people are going to find ways to work around and to solve that problem. And it's usually going to be in the form of shadow IT. Another reason why we're going to see more shadow IT in the late 2020s into the 2030s is because of the emergence of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence in some ways is the most flexible technology we've ever seen. It's the easiest to deploy, it's the easiest to start using. We can use it at a micro level. We can buy a personal subscription to ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, to Grok, whatever AI tool we want, and we can use it to do our jobs better. We don't necessarily need IT or corporate to approve it or to give us the green light to go ahead with it. Now, of course, a lot of companies and organizations throughout the world are trying to put policies in place and procedures in place that limit or at least manage the way people use AI. But generally speaking, AI opens a whole Pandora's box of potential shadow IT applications. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Are you seeing shadow IT in the form of AI tools? Because I imagine you probably are, and most clients we work with are seeing that as well. So now with AI becoming so prevalent, so commonly used in people's personal lives, they're bringing that same tool set to the workplace to make their jobs easier and to do their jobs. And never in the past have we really seen this sort of technology that's business related and personal related that crosses over so easily and makes it easy for people to use these solutions, which can be a good thing. But again, it creates a shadow IT dynamic where corporate doesn't necessarily have visibility to or access to what's being done with those tools. They don't have access to the data. They oftentimes don't have governance around it. And that creates a whole series of problems. And I'll talk about what you can do to solve some of these problems at the end of this video. Oftentimes when people ask me what the #1 ERP system is in the world, I'll half-jokingly say it's Microsoft Excel, because it's the most common ERP system in the world, and it has been since probably the 1990s. There's no other tool I can think of other than maybe Microsoft Outlook that's so commonly used and so commonly accepted and so easy for end users to use and adapt to. And that is the exact reason why Microsoft Excel and spreadsheets in general have become known for the premier shadow IT problem in a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations frown upon the fact that there's so many spreadsheets, there's so many different sources of truth, there's so many different mistakes that can be made in the spreadsheets, and a lot of limitations that I won't get into in this video. But the point here is that as long as Microsoft Excel and Google Sheets and other forms of spreadsheets exist and are easy for end users to use on their own without corporate IT's involvement, the more we're going to see that proliferation of spreadsheets running our business. Now, this is especially true when you combine this ease of use of spreadsheets with some of the other dynamics I've talked about in this video. The widespread use of AI, the limitations of ERP systems, etc. Some of those root causes are what cause people to want to go use Microsoft Excel spreadsheets to solve a problem. And so Excel spreadsheets are and will continue to be a very real part of the technology stack, whether you like it or not. And again, I would argue that Excel spreadsheets and other types of spreadsheets are going to be even more prevalent in the future for some of the reasons we're talking about on this video. And again, I'll tackle the problem of what you should do about it as a leader later at the end of this video. One of the most interesting dynamics of the enterprise technology space today is the fact that technology is changing exponentially faster than organizations are able to. And this has always been true to some degree, but we're on a sort of an exponential hockey stick curve right now where technological change is changing like this and increasing its pace and velocity and speed of change, whereas organizations aren't changing as quickly. Yes, they're changing, yes, they're trying to evolve, but big, massive organizations will never be able to move as fast as technology can, and they will never be able to change as fast as technology can and will and already is. So as we look to AI and cloud ERP and some of the other great technological solutions that have occurred in the marketplace, we are going to see the continued chasm or divide between technological change and organizational ability to change. And how do we fill that gap? If we can't change fast enough and technology is changing in a way that we can't keep up with organizationally and operationally, what we can do is use spreadsheets and other ways of leveraging technology to make up for that. And so think of it as the gap between where we are today, where we want to be in the future. That's the role that shadow IT oftentimes fills. And oftentimes a person can go develop their own shadow IT solution a lot faster than the overall organization can, which is why organizations end up in that mess of shadow IT and siloed systems in the first place. So we know shadow IT is a problem. It has been a problem historically, and I'm submitting to you that it's going to get even worse in the late 2020s into the 2030s. But what can you do about it as a leader? Well, the first is to recognize it for what it is, what it really is. As I mentioned before, shadow IT is not the root cause of the problem. It is a symptom of a deeper problem. Usually it's because the technology is flawed. Usually it's because the data is inaccurate. It could be because people aren't trained appropriately. There's a lot of reasons why shadow IT exists, and leaders need to get to the root cause of it. And I think the other part of this too, in addition to recognizing it as a symptom, not a root cause, is also not viewing it as such a terrible thing. Oftentimes we look at these spreadsheets and these ingenious workarounds that people have created, and it continues to fascinate me that someone somewhere figured out a way, despite limited data and technologies, they figured out a way to do their jobs in a pretty good way. Maybe it's not ideal, maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not sexy, but they figured out a way to do it. And so I think that's step one, is to recognize it for what it is. It's a solution, there's a reason it exists, and usually there's a deeper root cause for why it exists in the first place. Secondly, it's important to recognize the people side of transformation. Oftentimes the reason shadow IT exists is because there's some sort of behavioral or organizational change management issue that's causing it. It could be that people don't know how to use the technology the way it is today. Maybe they don't trust the technology. Maybe there's data governance issues that are creating problems with the data, so someone then has to take a spreadsheet and go fix and clean up the data because the organization as a whole, the humans in the organization, aren't keeping good track of the data and they're not keeping that data clean. So the people side of the equation is something that becomes very important if we truly want to address the shadow IT problem. The third thing leaders need to be aware of is optionality. This is a word that isn't talked about a lot, but it's very, very important in the enterprise technology space. As you're looking to how you're going to move forward with your organizational's technology needs, it's important to not back yourself into a corner. And that's exactly what a lot of organizations are doing, is they're getting locked into one vendor. They're getting locked into a cloud environment that limits the tools that can be used, limits the amount of flexibility that can be used. And what that's going to do is that is going to make shadow IT spread like wildfire, even more so in your organization, because if the technology can't change the way we need it to address our changing business needs, we will figure out a way to make it work anyway. And oftentimes that's going to be in the form of shadow IT. And then finally, it's important to have governance in place. If you have people that are using spreadsheets or AI tools or third-party solutions that haven't been approved by IT, a lot of times that's the problem. There's not governance in place. There's not policies and procedures and oversight in how people use technology. And oftentimes people at corporate and within IT don't fully understand the problems that the end users are trying to solve with their IT solutions, their shadow IT solutions. So that's another step you can take as a leader, is make sure you understand and have your ears to the ground to understand what's happening, why are people using the shadow IT, and what kind of policies can we put in place to ensure that instead of just developing new shadow IT, those needs and those challenges get escalated to the broader organization for resolution. So that was a video that talks about the rise of shadow IT and how AI and modern cloud and ERP systems are actually increasing the proliferation of shadow IT. It's not fixing it necessarily. In fact, I think it's making it worse. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Is shadow IT becoming worse? Do you see AI or ERP as the next wave of shadow IT? What are you doing to manage it within your organization? I'd love to hear your feedback below, and we'll talk about that in some future episodes as well. So that's what we've got for you here today. Appreciate you being here. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for Scott for being here. Thank you to the audience for the great questions. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same place. If you'd like to see any of the past episodes, go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also subscribe to the show on whichever platform you listen or watch by just going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. We've got it all aggregated there for you. So hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.